Please be seated. Do you ever wonder how exactly all those groups that were named in the first reading, poor Barbara had to figure out how to pronounce all those different groups, how it was that they all heard the gospel at the same time? I mean, when people started reading in all these different languages that are represented here, could you understand anything that was being said? Would you have even known what the gospel was if it hadn't been written down in a language that you could read? I mean, it doesn't exactly say in the reading from Acts that they all started speaking at once, but it's hard for me to imagine that a violent wind filled the room and tongues of fire came down on everybody's head, and then they all sat down in a nice circle and took turns reading the gospel in the language of their choice. It's probably not how it went, right? Frankly, it sounds a little bit like chaos when you hear it described that way, right? And that's kind of what it felt like for us too, I'm sure, in that moment. Did you hear what they said? They said it was the sound of a violent wind, a violent wind. What do you think a violent wind even sounds like, besides scary, right? And what did it look like when everybody had tongues of fire on their heads? Like they were on fire? Or like, how did that even... Really, it sounds like you're walking into a scene from a horror movie. And Peter's attempt to try to comfort everybody by quoting from the book of Joel did not help, right? He's like, oh, the sun's going to turn to darkness and the moon's going to turn to fire. And it's like, okay, to blood. Sorry, blood. And I'm already scared. I don't need to hear about this, right? It's hard for me to imagine that if that's what the scene seemed like, that people really thought, oh, these guys are just drunk. They've been partying a little too hard. You know, it doesn't sound like that to me at all. It sounds really kind of terrifying. But what the reading from Acts does tell us is that everybody heard the gospel in their own language. It wasn't, in fact, that everybody suddenly spoke the gospel in their language. They heard it, right? It was the Galileans who were speaking in all this long list of languages that they themselves might not have even known. And yet somehow people heard their own language being spoken, whether Galileans suddenly knew a language they'd never heard before, or somehow the Spirit translated it in midair. I don't know. But everybody heard their own language, heard the good news in the language that they knew. And I can't really know because I was reading the gospel in English, and that is my native language, but I do wonder if your native language was Mandarin or Russian or Italian, if you might have been able to hear it in that whole din of people reading. Because people do find each other like that, right? Think about how expats kind of come together when they're living in a foreign country, or immigrant communities come together in our own country when they're connected by a language, by a culture. And it doesn't always have to be a literal language, right? We find people who think like us, who feel like us. Sometimes our language is frustration. Sometimes our language is joy. Sometimes our language is gratitude. Have you ever had the experience of feeling like you were the only whatever you are in the room? And then realizing that you were not in fact alone, that there was a community that you held something in common with, maybe not everybody in the room, but that there was a place, a language that resonated with you. I think as scary as Pentecost was, maybe there was a little bit of that comfort as well. I know many of you probably already know this, but the Holy Spirit's my favorite. She's the best, right? I'm not saying that I don't love Jesus. Of course I do, and I'm trying to follow him. And obviously our Creator does amazing things that awe me all the time. But the Holy Spirit really brings it all together, doesn't she? You know? I mean, the Holy Spirit is everything, but kind of nothing, right? Earth and wind and fire. Wait, that's a band. Sorry. Fire, water. And that feeling that comes up inside of you when you know you're called to do something, you're meant to do something, you have these gifts. It's the Spirit that was breathed over all of creation. It's not just within each of us or beyond each of us, but also connecting all of us. It's beautiful. And if you believe what Jesus says, and I generally do, even though I love the Holy Spirit, we need the Holy Spirit, right? Because if our whole thing is that God, this creative force that drives the universe, became incarnate, became human, right, in Jesus, what happens when Jesus dies? I mean, he's resurrected. We already know that. We celebrated that 50 days ago. And it's a little different, isn't it? So what happens to incarnation in the face of resurrection? And I'm guessing that when the disciples were listening to Jesus give his final address to them before he was led to his death, that probably wasn't the primary question on their minds. That complicated theological assessment about incarnation and resurrection. But Jesus answered it anyway, because it turns out the answer is a little simpler than the question. Jesus said, I will not leave you alone. You are not going to be alone. I will be with you. I still have things to say to you. I still have things to teach you, and I will keep teaching, keep speaking, keep being present. My work here is not done. Which I think is a bit of a comfort, right? I mean, this is why we call the Holy Spirit the Holy Comforter sometimes. It's not because when your friend says that they're going to church this morning at Holy Comforter and Saint Pillow, that's a different comforter, okay? Not a blanket, the one who gives us comfort. But today's gospel also tells us that the Holy Spirit is called the advocate, sometimes the paraclete, right? Which means the Holy Spirit is a lawyer and the world is on trial. Which doesn't sound quite as comforting, does it? Right? To be facing Jesus' death and be told that, and then we're going to go to battle for the soul of the world. Oh gosh, no thank you. That sounds scary too. But I was reading writing of Andrew McGowan, who was one of my seminary professors, and he was talking about the words that Jesus actually says in this gospel, and that they're not quite as terrifying as they might sound, right? Because this whole story that's about to end and begin again changed everything, right? And so what we learn from Jesus' life on earth, from his teachings, from his death and resurrection, is going to change the world. And it's going to keep changing the world. So when people come to understand that God is with them, they're also going to come to understand the ways that they have alienated themselves from God, which is what we call sin, right? And when we think about righteousness, this is the only time the author of the Gospel of John uses the word righteousness, which is surprising if you read the Gospel of John, because he's kind of into righteousness, but he never says it, except for right here. Because who Jesus is and was and always will be, his death, his resurrection, it makes us rethink about what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is important. And I know nobody wants judgment, but the truth of the matter is our God is a God of love, so our God is also a God of judgment, because love makes no place for evil. And even though we are working in the world to bring God's message of love as one of grace and reconciliation, it's also true that we can make no place for those things that are working to destroy the creatures of God, those things that are going against God, those things that are contrary to the love of God. You see, the Holy Spirit makes us the church, right? That's our first birthday gift. We become Christ living in the world, Christ's body at work in the world through the Holy Spirit. We become not the people who have perfected every ritual, although we obviously have. Not the people who believe exactly the right thing, but the people who show who Christ is by the way we live, and by the way we live with each other, right? We believe that God is with us, we believe that God's love reigns supreme, and we believe that nothing can stop it. Nothing is more powerful than God's love. And you should know that by how we live and how we live together. Now, it is a weird time to be church. I don't know if you agree with me or not, but my girls had all these things planned today, like class parties and sports team events, and I kept saying to Carol, but it's Pentecost. And she said, very few people care about that besides you. Thank you for being here and joining me in caring about Pentecost. But the world, many people in the world have had little experience of church. And what experience they have had has made them decide they don't want to have any more experience of church, right? They don't want to be part of a judgmental, hypocritical, homophobic organization. And so it's hard to try to speak into that. We are not the church we once were, right? We don't have the numbers and the budget and the children and all the things we wish we still had. And yet, in the ways that matter, we are still the church we've always been, right? Because we are still a group of people trying to follow Jesus, trying to discern what God would have each of us and all of us do in this world. We are still a place where people can hear good news in their own language, even if we didn't know we spoke that language, right? We are still a community that's trying to live differently, to show the power of God's love in this world right now. The thing about birth is, if you walked in at the wrong time and you didn't know what you were walking in on, you might think you were seeing a horror story, right? I mean, I've always thought birthdays are funny for this reason, right? Because it's like, on this day, many, many years ago, my mother was in extreme agony. Let's have a party, right? You know, we use the word pain like it's a minor annoyance, you know, like I had to stand in the line at the post office for too long and it was a pain. That's not what labor pains are like, my friends, okay? That is real pain. And of course, we don't have birthdays to celebrate that pain. We celebrate the life that came from that pain, right? The life that pain could not have emerged without that pain, right? And that's what we're celebrating for the birth of our church as well. But we know that the whole of creation is longing for the message that the church has, right? That the whole of creation is in labor pains, trying to give birth to something it doesn't fully understand and sometimes can't quite see. And so too are we. But that is why we got this beautiful gift on our first birthday of the Holy Spirit. We have always been a people who are a little bit about terrified and a little bit about awesome, right? Because that's kind of how God moves in the world sometimes. From that first moment they found that tomb empty, they were awed and terrified. And so we continue to be. But the Spirit works in us and between us and among us so that we can continue to show the love of God that we have known, so that we can keep the promises we made, to carry on our traditions, to try to make things better, to treat everybody like Jesus, to be good news in the way that we live, and to work for justice and peace and the dignity of every human being. And that is a tall order, and it is terrifying and awesome. And most importantly, it is always worth celebrating. Happy birthday.